would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment.
I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
GB News has its own late-night paper preview show, Headliners, where comedians take you through the next day's top news stories. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper, we've got it covered for you. Headliners, every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hi, Andrew Pierce here. Join me every Friday lunchtime for a proper no-nonsense debrief of the week's events. With special guests in the studio and the GB News team on the ground, I'll be getting you up to date with news, some intelligent discussion and my own sharp take. The weekend starts here with me every Friday lunchtime on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat. Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. I campaigned in the largest democratic vote in our island's story. I know this country has so much to be proud of. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better. The wisdom of the nation is in its people. Vox Populi, Vox Dei. That's why I'm joining the People's Channel. Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
What a St David's Day. The front page of The Telegraph is covered in leaks. Apologies for the terrible joke. Today we'll be talking about Matt Hancock's WhatsApp messages. Also, the fallout from this Windsor framework. Prime Minister's questions coming up at midday. How on earth will it all fall out? Well, we'll be following it all after the headlines.
Good morning, it's 9:30. I'm Ray Addison in the GB Newsroom. Former Health Secretary Matt Hancock reportedly rejected advice from the government's chief medical officer over care home testing during the pandemic. An investigation by the Telegraph newspaper claims that Mr Hancock was advised to test all residents going into English care homes for COVID, not just those arriving from hospital. The article, which cites more than 100,000 leaked WhatsApp messages, claims Mr Hancock was concerned it would get in the way of his target of 100,000 daily tests. A spokesperson for the MP says the messages have been stolen and doctored to create a false story. Mountain rescue volunteers have joined the search for a missing baby in Brighton. It comes after the newborn's parents, Constance Martin and Mark Gordon, were further arrested on suspicion of gross negligence manslaughter. The couple were captured on Monday night after almost 2 months on the run. Over 200 police officers have been searching over 90 square miles of land, with risk to the baby believed to be extremely high. At least 36 people have died and more than 80 are injured after 2 trains collided in Greece last night. An intercity train carrying over 300 passengers hit a freight train travelling in the opposite direction near the city of Larissa. The crash caused carriages to catch fire, with rescuers working through the night to find survivors. And UK house prices fell by 1.1% year-on-year in February, according to the Nationwide Building Society, marking the first annual decline since June of 2020. Last month, the average house price was around £257,000. Prices are now 3.7% lower than their August 2022 peak. On TV, online and on DAB+ radio, this is GB News. Back now to the briefing with Tom Harwood.
Good morning, it's 9:33 and this is the briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and your radio. And Dydd Gwyl Dewi Hapus to all the viewers in Wales and across the Welsh diaspora today as well. Happy St David's Day. Now, leaked messages suggesting that former Health Secretary Matt Hancock rejected the advice of the Chief Medical Officer to test all residents entering care homes have been published this morning by the Daily Telegraph, with Matt Hancock's team vehemently rejecting the conclusions reached in the press, accusing the journalist Isabel Oakeshott, who is behind these leaks, of breaching a legal non-disclosure agreement, and accusing the Telegraph of, quote, doctoring these messages. Well, Catherine Forster is our political reporter in Westminster this morning. And Catherine, these are fairly explosive allegations.
Yes, they certainly are. Broke late last night with the Telegraph front page, saying fundamentally that Matt Hancock, who was, of course, Health Secretary, ignored the advice of Chris Whitty, the Chief Medical Officer, to test everybody going into a care home. Now, that, of course, is pretty damning, and it has come from 100,000 WhatsApp messages that journalist Isabel Oakeshott handed over to the Telegraph. Now, Isabel co-wrote Matt Hancock's pandemic diaries along with him, and so was previously very friendly with him, and now that has obviously soured. Now, Matt Hancock's team are absolutely incandescent with rage. They're saying that this is flat out wrong, that the story has been distorted because there's a WhatsApp message referring to a meeting. They say in that meeting, Matt Hancock was told, although he wanted to test everybody going into care homes, that they simply didn't have the capacity, and that is why he was therefore only able to test people going into care homes that were coming in from hospital. So they are very angry. They're threatening legal action. Isabel Oakeshott apparently would have signed a non-disclosure agreement and was writing in Matt Hancock's support when the pandemic diaries came out of basically that history would reflect that he'd done his best. But that looks rather different today.
It's interesting because Matt Hancock's team is saying the proper avenue to discuss all of this is not on the front pages of newspapers, but it is in this COVID inquiry, which is now underway. Hancock has said he's handed over all of these messages to the inquiry now. Do we have any indication when we might be seeing sort of the more dispassionate analysis?
Well, we really don't, because this inquiry looks set to continue for some considerable time. And of course, many people feel very strongly that lockdown was badly handled. People lost relatives. There's a lot of anger. There's a lot of emotion around this, of course. So I think ultimately we will have to wait for the inquiry, but clearly Matt Hancock has been hoping to sort of reset his life, going into the jungle, putting out these very extensive pandemic diaries in which he basically said that he did the best he could. And it is quite extraordinary now that the person that co-wrote those diaries has now changed her tune completely and is saying we need to get this out into the public domain now. Of course, the Telegraph has been fairly critical of lockdown and the effects that it has had, so that suits their particular agenda.
Of course, Isabel Oakeshott is someone who's been very critical of lockdown policy as well. She was one of the foremost journalists in the country throughout the course of the pandemic, scrutinising those government decisions. Might we now take a look at Matt Hancock and perhaps the wisdom of his decision to hand over 100,000 of his own messages to a journalist who, let's face it, he profoundly disagreed with on the signature policy of the last 3 years? Was it the wisest decision of Matt Hancock to work with Isabel Oakeshott on his diaries?
Well, today it would seem not. In retrospect, Isabel Oakeshott said that she had done the work for nothing, but that she would be remunerated in other ways, whatever that meant. But it is quite extraordinary, and they are incredibly, incredibly angry, because it basically looks like these stories coming out now undo what Matt Hancock thought was his sort of rehabilitation with the public, or so he hoped, in the jungle and with the diaries, his side of the story. But I do think that, you know, it is when the inquiry finally reports that all what happened, what didn't happen, what should have happened, what should have been done differently, will be laid out clearly in a dispassionate fashion.
Well, Catherine Forster, thank you so much for joining us this morning on The Briefing. Really, really interesting story there, which no doubt will have many more twists and turns as the days go on. But of course, this is a big story that marks a busier day in politics. Of course, yesterday, the Prime Minister returned to London from Northern Ireland, addressing the 1922 committee of backbench Tory MPs in Parliament, all about his new Windsor framework, which, so far at least, has avoided rebellion from the Eurosceptics within his party. Now, as always on a Wednesday, eyes will be glued to the Commons chamber for Prime Minister's questions at midday. And one of the members of Parliament who will be there and listening intently to the Prime Minister is Michael Fabricant, the Conservative MP for Lichfield. Michael, thank you for joining me this morning. First of all, you were at that 1922 committee meeting last night. What did you make of what the Prime Minister said?
Well, as ever, he was very, very enthusiastic. He's enthusiastic about the deal. And what was interesting was that the audience, the MPs, were enthusiastic about the deal as well. It was actually very well received. But I hate using cliches, but the cliche, of course, is the devil will be in the detail. And the meeting we had with the Prime Minister was at 5 o'clock. Then I had a meeting at 6 o'clock with the ERG, of which I'm a member. There's about 100 members of the ERG. And they're going to take their time, as will the DUP, in analysing all the ramifications of the deal, because it is a very, very complex deal. And the lawyers were saying it will take at least 2 weeks to come to a conclusion.
That's a really interesting point, because, of course, we don't have a time frame on any sort of parliamentary vote. We've sort of had the deal in the public domain for just under 48 hours. Are you suggesting the ERG's own time frame there is probably 2 weeks before we will hear a definitive conclusion?
Well, Bill Cash chairs the committee of lawyers, and I specifically asked him how long it would take to come to a conclusion. And his answer to me was it would take 2 weeks. And I think that's now been broadly publicised in the press. So 2 weeks, at least, actually, is what he said. I hope it won't take quite as long. Of course, we've had some very interesting reports in the newspapers today, in the Telegraph and the Times and others, looking at the EU statement about the agreement, comparing it with the British government statement. And I think that will focus minds. Will VAT be totally in the hands of the British government? Will state aid again be totally in the hands of the British government as far as Northern Ireland? These are issues which will have to be investigated.
Certainly, lots and lots of detail to go through. I believe 16 individual documents published by the British government on Monday, hundreds of pages,
I've got them on the
legal
side of my
text.
desk.
You've got the command paper there in your hand. I have to say, Michael Fabricant, have you read the command paper? And frankly, will your colleagues be reading every letter within that command paper?
I've read some of it, but I've got constituency work to do as well. So I'm delegating it rather, as I think many MPs will do, to the lawyers of the ERG and journalists like you, who will have a team of people going through it and analysing where there are differences, if there are differences, between what the Prime Minister has said and what the lawyers think will be the difference with what the actual legal situation is.
Now, of course, the big story that is dominating many headlines this morning are these leaked WhatsApp messages from the former Health Secretary. I suppose that it's almost inevitable there will be questions on this in Prime Minister's questions. Michael Fabricant, you were a big supporter of the government during that time, 2020, 2021. What's your takeaway from these headlines and these messages this morning?
Well, they certainly are headlines. I mean, it rather reminds me of when the Telegraph leaked all those years ago the expense claims, which led to a huge scandal. I don't think, though, that this is quite like that. First of all, some of the WhatsApp messages are taken out of context. I mean, I used to WhatsApp the Health Secretary regarding these various matters as well during COVID and things that affected me, that is to say my constituency in Lichfield, and he was very, very good at responding. But the decisions were not made by WhatsApp, which is what Labour will be trying to portray. The decisions were made by Cabinet and by the committees which are subject to Cabinet control. So, let's just wait and see precisely how this goes. I think what it does demonstrate is we need to get this national inquiry into COVID underway sooner rather than later. Otherwise, there's just going to be constant speculation. Of course, what I would say is I do think that Hancock was rather naive to release all his messages to a journalist. And in fact, we're being constantly told by the House of Commons authorities about foreign actors in Russia, Iran, and elsewhere trying to hack into our mobile phones. So to actually give your mobile phone to a journalist who was known to be hostile to lockdown strikes me as being rather reckless.
Do you think this might be something that the Information Commissioner should start to investigate, whether Matt Hancock's handling of his own personal, private, confidential data that might well have national security implications, perhaps, was done in a proper way?
Well, I think the Information Commissioner is already considering it, if I'm honest with you. I'll leave it to him, or is it a her? I'm not sure who it is, to decide.
It certainly used to be a her. I'm not sure if it's changed in the last 6 months or so. But Michael Fabricant, for now, thank you so much for joining us here on The Briefing. We always appreciate your thoughts on those two big issues. But let's get more now on this Brexit deal, because I'm delighted to be joined on College Green in Westminster by the Brexit titan, former Labour Member of Parliament, now independent peer, Baroness Kate Hoey. And Kate, obviously someone who originates from Northern Ireland originally, you take a very keen interest in precisely what went on with the protocol and what has been now proposed with the Westminster framework, with the Windsor framework, I should say. Just first of all, I'm very interested to see what your first impressions were to the Prime Minister's announcement on Monday.
Well, Tom, I actually live full-time in Northern Ireland. Now I have done since I gave up being a Member of Parliament, so I'm very interested. It's my home. Now, the reality is that Rishi Sunak made a very optimistic, upbeat speech, which if you read it and listened to him, you'd have thought, wonderful, everything's solved, it's marvellous. The DUP will be running back into Stormont tomorrow. The reality is There are a lot of documents to do with his speech. There's a lot of detail. The most interesting one, and I've read a lot of things now about it, but not everything I can say, but the EU document that came out is the most interesting, because practically everything that Rishi said, then you look at what the EU are saying, and of course it's quite different. Sometimes similar, but usually different, with a very clear interpretation of the fact that the EU law and EU justice courts and EU generally are still in charge. So I think, first of all, the Prime Minister, I welcome that he's allowing and saying there'll be a lot of time for people to read it properly. But of course, in the end, even if the DUP oppose it, it will go through Parliament because Labour is supporting it. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the executive will come back, or that President Biden will get his visit, which is what an awful lot of this rush is about. President Biden wants to come in April, and he can't come if the Northern Ireland executive's not sitting, because that would show the Belfast Agreement was broken.
Which is fascinating, because it does seem that this was all done. Number 10 has denied for the last few months that they were working to any sort of deadline. But behind the scenes, it does seem that the 25th anniversary of the signing of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement has been some sort of informal deadline in all of this. What effect do you think that that's had on the talks?
Oh, I think without a doubt, the Irish government have been chasing and pushing quite a lot, and have been a little bit, I would say, more flexible recently, because they are desperate to get President Biden there too. But also behind the scene, the Americans, don't underestimate the influence of American officials in America on our foreign service and on wanting to have this visit. And of course, I'm sure Rishi Sunak would like to have it as well. So it's definitely been there. There's been that push to get something. And I just think anyone who reads it will realise that sometimes I think Downing Street and people advising the Prime Minister don't really understand Northern Ireland. And a lot of members of Parliament, I'm afraid, only take an interest in Northern Ireland when something like this is happening. And I think if they knew what was really going on, they would see that for 2 or 3 years now, people have been speaking out about the protocol, saying all the things now that Rishi Sunak is saying has been broken about it. We've been saying that for months and months and months, and now we've got something that he is saying is wonderful and is really ensuring Northern Ireland's place in the United Kingdom. It doesn't actually come out like that when you read the documents. However, the DUP will look at it, everyone is going to examine it, and we will just going to have to wait and see. But every day I think we'll find something new that is not quite what Rishi Sunak said.
You speak a lot to the people in the DUP, and I just wonder if, even if everything about this deal isn't perfect, if there is compromise made within it, certainly the EU has moved on its original positions. There were some things the EU said were impossible a few years ago that are now certainly part of this deal. I wonder if you think that after all of these years of wrangling backwards and forwards, there is perhaps room now for a greater degree of compromise.
Well, of course, the DUP have been out of government now. There's been no executive for nearly a year. Sinn Féin, don't let's forget, brought down the executive for 3 years, and I didn't see Westminster MPs up in arms and calling on Sinn Féin, to come back. So there is a bit of double standards here when it comes to what unionism does and what Sinn Féin does, because of course unionism hasn't been linked to paramilitary terrorism. However, I think the DUP will look carefully. Remember, they have a mandate. They have a very clear mandate at the election at the last election not to go back into government until the 7 tests were met. And if you look at the 7 tests, the one question I asked yesterday in our statement in the House of Lords was about the Acts of Union, because the Prime Minister has said that is very, very important. And I said, well, where is the legal text now that is going to go back on what the Supreme Court itself said, that the Acts of Union had been subjugated, and therefore I want to know where that legal text is that we're going to be back as an integral part of the United Kingdom. And unless that happens, that is a hugely important test of the DUP. And then we look at something like the green lanes, which have been said is wonderful now. The reality is that everything that still comes is going to have paperwork, is going to have to still do quite a lot of bureaucracy. It's not a green lane. If it was a real green lane, we wouldn't need a green lane. And the idea that somebody trading from Birmingham to Bristol and then Birmingham to Belfast has to go through huge extra bureaucracy. Not as bad maybe as it was, and there won't be so many checks, but it's not just about the checks. And it's it may sound little things like that, but those are the details that actually affect everyday lives, and that's what the DUP will be thinking about.
It'll be fascinating over the next, perhaps, 2 weeks, how many of those details bubble up to the surface. But for now, Kate Hoey, thank you so much for joining us there on College Green outside Westminster. We just have time for a final story this morning, setting our sights to business and growth, and indeed to the budget that's expected in a couple of weeks' time. Now, there's this enormous obstacle sitting between those two key elements of business and growth. That is the corporation tax rise that is scheduled to take place in April. Chancellor Jeremy Hunt, during his ultimately unsuccessful leadership campaign last summer, preached the fundamental need to cut corporation tax. He wanted to cut it down to 15% in order to stimulate economic growth. And yet 7 months later, and he seems to have changed his mind. He's raising corporation tax from 19 to 25%, in line with France, and almost, or indeed double, the rate at which Ireland levies corporation tax. Now, new analysis suggests that this could cost the United Kingdom, cost us all, £30.2 billion of lost GDP after a decade. Well, I'm delighted to be joined now by Joe Ventre, the digital campaign manager at the Taxpayers Alliance. And Joe, how do we arrive at this figure? It seems like an enormous amount of money in lost economic activity due to this tax rise.
Well, first of all, good morning, Tom, and thank you for having me on. Essentially, what we've done is, through our analysis, is we've run this corporation tax rise through what we call a dynamic tax model. And what that does is it doesn't just look at the sort of short-term effects of a tax rise like we see in the Treasury, where they just measure the immediate revenue that comes off the back of a tax rise. What this does is it looks at the knock-on effects. It looks at the effect it will have on GDP, looks at the effect it will have on investment and weekly earnings over a 10-year period. And what we see is absolutely devastating numbers. We see that, £30 billion of lost GDP over 10 years, almost £12 billion of lost investment over 10 years. So, these are huge, huge numbers, really concerning numbers. And I think what it really cements is that a corporation tax rise of this scale is going to be a disaster for British business, a disaster for employees and unemployed people, and a disaster for consumers as well.
It is interesting because we've seen a letter in recent days from former chancellors who might not agree on very much. You might not put Philip Hammond and Kwasi Kwarteng in the same box on much of politics, and yet they agree, as does George Osborne, that this tax rise is a very bad decision to come at this particular time. Do you think there's any chance the government will be listening?
Well, I certainly hope so. I mean, Tom, we don't even need to go that far back, to be honest. As you said at the start there, Jeremy Hunt himself even said that the current rate of corporation tax is too high. As we know, he proposed a 15% rise a 15% rate, I should say, when he was running for leadership, because as he said, it was, it was the type of tax cut that would deliver growth and get the economy moving. So the question to ask really is what's changed? It seems that the Chancellor knew what the problem was and yet has fallen into this trap of what we call Treasury orthodoxy, where again, we're just looking at the short-term revenues and treating businesses and taxpayers as cash cows. But of course, what the government needs to do now is look at the longer-term effects. Let's look 10 years down the line and see where we're going to end up. And I think this sort of short-term thinking is going to be disastrous for us all.
Now, you might make that point that this is short-term thinking, that this is perhaps a false economy, getting money in today but losing money in the future. The Treasury might respond to that saying that, hang on, we tried some tax cuts a few months ago and the international markets panicked. Do they not have a point?
Well, of course, the fundamental mistake there that the previous government made was to hinge that all on borrowing, whereas what we would be saying is let's look at matching savings across the public sector, across government expenditure. I mean, if you look today, Labour have revealed almost £30 billion of waste across the public sector, enormous amounts. And of course, we know that the IFS are now saying that we have around £56 billion of fiscal headroom moving into this budget. So there certainly is the space for tax cuts. And I think the government simply needs to be bold and embrace those and give businesses some much needed breathing room.
Well, Joe Ventre, thank you so much for joining us this morning on The Briefing. Really, really interesting stuff there. And I should just say, Dydd Goel, Dewi Hapus again. There we go. Happy St David's Day. This is all that we have time for today on The Briefing. Join me again at 9:30 tomorrow. But up next, it's Bev Turner Today.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel. Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates. Do you not believe in prison?
I don't believe in prison.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed. So I guess they've always been quite woke. That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel. Britain's news channel.
We are GB News, the People's Channel.
And right across the United Kingdom.
You can find us on Sky Channel 512.
Virgin Media Channel 604.
Freesat Channel 216.
Freeview Channel 236.
And YouView Channel 236.
You can also take us with you on DAB+ radio.
With the GB News app and at the website gbnews.uk.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Come join us on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. Hello, I'm Michael Portillo. You can join me every Sunday on GB News. Remember to subscribe to the GB News YouTube channel and to download the GB News app to stay up to date with the latest GB News content. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's